Who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and how can we know with any certainty? Unless you've got a time machine stashed in your garage someplace, we will have to rely on historical methodology to guide us on our quest. And that is exactly what the documentary hypothesis is. It is a method used by scholars to help them determine who the author or authors of the Old Testament might have been. The texts in question today will be the first 5 books of the Bible, that being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are many words or short phrases that all mean the first 5 books of the Bible, like Pentateuch, Torah, books of Moses, or books of the law. In the simplest terms, the documentary hypothesis is a method used by Bible scholars to trace the sources of written content that made it into the final version of the Pentateuch that we have today. But wait a minute, don't we already know who the author of the Torah is? It's Moses, right? Well, there is an ancient tradition that says that Moses was indeed the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, but historically, we may have reason to doubt this. And we're going to touch on this more in just a moment, but for now, it's important to realize that nobody really knows who wrote the Torah because the Torah itself doesn't tell us. It's anonymous. And this isn't weird. Almost every ancient text from the ancient Near East is anonymous. It wasn't until the spread of Greek culture into the Middle East in the 4th century BCE when it became common in Israel for authors to identify themselves in their own writings. It was also during this time that we began seeing pseudepigraphical writings, meaning people began making up authors for existing writings, usually claiming that these writings were written by famous historical figures like Moses and Enoch. There are actually entire volumes of works written under a false name pretending to be people from the Old Testament. It's called Old Testament pseudepigrapha. And this actually makes sense. It sounds terrible, but it makes sense why someone would do this. I mean, think about it. They were living in the ancient world before publishing houses and before the time of social media influencers. And if you wrote a text and you wanted somebody to read it, wouldn't you claim to be someone famous? Many faithful Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe that Moses wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy. This is known as Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Mosaic authorship is a belief that quite possibly dates back to the 7th century BCE to the reforms of King Josiah, or maybe to the 6th century BCE to the Babylonian exile. Even though the belief in Mosaic authorship dates back almost 3,000 years, this has never been a universal belief. It has been questioned and challenged by various different people throughout various different times in history. Consider, for example, the church father Jerome. He said around the year 400 CE that he believed that Ezra the priest wrote the Pentateuch based on notes written by Moses. So he didn't believe Moses actually wrote the Torah. In the 12th century, a medieval Jewish scholar named Ibn Ezra noted some interesting insertions in the book of Genesis. Genesis 12:6 says, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. This would imply that this was written at a time when the Canaanites were not in the land. Well, the Canaanites were in the land all throughout Moses' life. It wasn't until the conquests of Joshua, and probably even later than that the Canaanites were no longer in the land. This was well after the death of Moses. Another example of this can be found in Genesis chapter 36, verse 31. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom, before any king reigned over the Israelites. The key word here is before. Again, here we have an anachronistic editorial insertion. Whoever wrote this must have lived at a time when there were kings ruling over the Israelites. Kings didn't rule in Israel for almost 1,000 years after Moses had already died. Unless Moses lived to be as old as Methuselah, I think it's pretty clear that Moses did not write the Torah, or at least that there were other editorial insertions added later. And not to mention the fact that at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it details the death of Moses. It'd be pretty difficult to write about your own death, unless, of course, you had some sort of vision about your death before you died, which actually some people do believe. Now let's fast forward all the way to the 19th century, when 2 German scholars, Karl Heinrich Graf and Julius Wellhausen, formulated the classic version of the documentary hypothesis, also known as the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis. Julius Wellhausen usually gets all the credit for the documentary hypothesis, when in reality, he built upon the work that was already accomplished by Gene Astruc, a man that many regard as the father of biblical source criticism. Gene Astruc was a convert to Catholicism who became a personal physician to King Louis XV. In 1735, Astruc observed that there are two different names for God used in the Pentateuch. Sometimes God is called Elohim, which is kind of a generic term for God, and sometimes God is called by his personal name, Yahweh. Well, Gene Astruc suggested that the author who used the term Elohim was a different person from the author who used the personal name for God of Yahweh. It became clear at this point that something needed to be done to help explain these findings in the Pentateuch. Like, why are there variations in the divine name of God? Why are there anachronisms? Why are some stories called twice, but with different details? These are called doublets. Also, why are there different literary styles and vocabulary used throughout the Pentateuch? These are the questions the documentary hypothesis seeks to answer. Julius Wellhausen established that there were at least 4 different authors or sources that were combined together to make the Pentateuch that we have today. Julius Wellhausen thought of this kind of like a patchwork quilt, right? A quilt is one unit, but it's made up of a lot of different fabric stitched and woven together. Wellhausen thought the Pentateuch was like this as well, that old material was stitched and woven together to create something new. It was kind of like the ancient version of cut, copy, and paste. But what exactly are these sources that Wellhausen established? Those sources are known as J, E, D, and P. J stands for the Yahwistic source, E stands for the Elohistic source, D stands for the Deuteronomistic source, and P stands for the priestly source. Now I'm going to cut it off there and say if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering at this point why there's a J for the Yahwistic source instead of a Y. Well, I wondered this too, and as it turns out, it's because of how the divine name of God was translated over time. Eventually, Jews stopped writing out the divine name Yahweh and instead inserted the 4-letter stand-in YHWH. This is called the Tetragrammaton. Eventually, Jews stopped pronouncing the divine name and the official pronunciation was lost. There was a vocalization of the Tetragrammaton by later Jews that was pronounced Yehovah. Yehovah eventually became Latinized and became Ihovah. Then, when William Tyndale translated the Bible into English in the early 16th century, he took the Latinized Ihovah and used a special I that looked like a J. J was not yet a letter in English. Then, when Germans got a hold of this translation, they began to pronounce the J with a J sound. Thus, the divine name was now pronounced Jehovah. J, E, D, and P all have unique characteristics that help scholars determine when they appear in the biblical text. Let's start with P because it's usually the easiest source to recognize. The P, or priestly source, can be identified by its dry, formulaic, and list-like style. P has a strong interest in genealogies, dates, and ritual observance. P has no angels, no dreams, or talking animals. For P, history is peppered by a series of covenants, like the ones between Noah, Abraham, and Moses. The book of Leviticus is quintessential priestly material, and so is the description of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. The priest, or more likely the school of priests responsible for the priestly material, were Levitical priests, primarily interested in correct ritual observance and centralizing the Aaronite priesthood. Dating these sources are subject to scholarly scrutiny, but Wellhausen dated P to the 6th or 5th century BCE, which makes the P source the latest of all the sources. The next source is the D source, or the Deuteronomistic source. Like P, this source usually poses very few problems. D is primarily found in the book of Deuteronomy, although modern scholarship has attempted to find D in other Pentateuchal books as well. A common characteristic trait of D is that Yahweh loves Israel, and Israel is commanded to love Yahweh. The central theme in D is the covenant, and the seemingly most important commandment is that it forbids sacrifice outside the central sanctuary. Wellhausen dated the D source to the 7th century BCE, when King Josiah's priest Hilkiah found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. Next, we have the E source, or the Elohistic source. As you might be able to imagine, the E source is most notable for using the generic name for God, which is Elohim. And actually, Elohim is a plural word that literally means gods, probably originally referring to the Canaanite god El's royal court of lesser gods. Elohim eventually became a generic word used to refer to just one god. Also, in E is the association of revelations with dreams. E reflects on problems of guilt and innocence and emphasizes the fear of God. According to the Old Testament scholar Dr. John J. Collins, E has no primeval history. It begins with Abraham in Genesis 15. Wellhausen dates E to the 8th century BCE, and most modern scholars would agree that E is later than J. Lastly, we have the J source, which is the earliest, or in other words, the oldest source material in the entire Pentateuch, known as the Yahwistic source. J uses the specific and divine name for God, Yahweh. J is more colorful than E. You can recognize J from the familiar story of Adam and Eve, with its anthropomorphic God walking around in the cool of the day in the garden and talking snake scenes. For J, God is described in very human terms. God walks. God has emotions of anger, regret, and pleasure. God is specifically pleased when smelling the odor of animal sacrifice. Abraham argues with Yahweh over the fate of Sodom, and he actually begins to change God's mind. Also common in J is that God is represented by the angel of the Lord, who appears on earth. The theme of promise and fulfillment is also prominent in the J source. J and E are sometimes kind of difficult to distinguish. For example, in the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22, it's E in nature, but it uses the divine name Yahweh. So it's E or is it J? It's difficult to piece together, so the documentary hypothesis is not without its challenges. To make matters even more challenging, many scholars believe that there was a later redactor who lived around the 8th century BCE who redacted the J and E sources. And by redacted, I just mean he came in and made his own slight insertions, or maybe even he copied and pasted some things of his own. This source is known as RJE, and scholars believe this happened with the Deuteronomistic material as well. This is known sometimes as just R, or sometimes it's known as DR, and it stands for the redacted Deuteronomistic source. So who exactly wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Well, we don't really know, but it seems likely that it wasn't Moses. As a matter of fact, it seems likely that it wasn't one person at all. It was likely many people living throughout different time periods, and their material got stitched and woven together by a later redactor. Stay thirsty for knowledge.